She was 19, far from home, and desperate to prove herself. Louise Woodward arrived in Massachusetts in 1996, an English au pair assigned through a childcare agency to the Porton family, 2 doctors, both overworked, both convinced that hiring a bright, polite teenager from abroad would give their infant son, Matthew, a safe and nurturing environment. For months, life appeared ordinary. Diaper changes, strolls through Newton's leafy suburbs, the rhythmic quiet of domestic routine. Friends remembered Louise as confident and affectionate. The parents described her as capable. Nothing suggested that the next few weeks would make her name known around the world. In February 1997, everything changed. Baby Matthew was found unresponsive, rushed to hospital with a fractured skull and severe brain injury. Doctors identified massive bleeding, the kind associated with what was then called shaken baby syndrome. Within days, suspicion turned to the only adult with the child at the time. Louise told police the baby had slipped from her arms, that she had shaken him only lightly to revive him. But her words didn't match the medical reports, and soon the narrative hardened. The teenager from England had fatally assaulted the infant she was trusted to protect. The image of the young au pair crying in handcuffs, uniformed officers guiding her past cameras, ignited a storm that blended grief, class tension, and cultural divide. Was this a case of violent neglect or tragic accident? To the Portons, it was justice for their child. To others, it was a rush to judgment, fueled by media outrage and prosecutorial zeal. As days turned into weeks, every detail of Louise's behavior was dissected. Former co-workers described her impatience. Others swore she adored the baby. Prosecutors claimed she lost control after a sleepless night. Defense attorneys argued that the boy's head injuries were cumulative, possibly caused days before. The hospital became a war zone of experts, each interpreting bruises, fractures, and blood patterns differently. Outside the courtroom, lines were drawn. British tabloids painted her as a victim of an unforgiving American system. US talk shows branded her a murderer hiding behind an accent. Candlelight vigils and protests erupted on both sides of the Atlantic. Amid the chaos, one quiet truth emerged. Beneath all the medical testimony and national rhetoric lay a single fragile premise: trust. A family's trust in a caregiver. A caregiver's trust in her own judgment. And when that trust fractured, an infant's life became the center of a global reckoning. The case would soon move to trial, and with it, the question that no jury could answer without doubt. Was this a crime of violence or a catastrophe of circumstance? The courtroom in Cambridge, Massachusetts, became a global stage. Cameras hovered outside, reporters fought for seats, and every facial twitch of Louise Woodward was analyzed as if it held the secret to innocence or guilt. Inside, the prosecution framed her as a careless and violent teenager who snapped under pressure. They described a single, catastrophic act, a furious shake, a fatal throw, a moment that transformed a healthy baby into a victim of irreversible trauma. They called doctors who presented scans, charts, and photos of bleeding behind the infant's eyes. To them, the science was clear. This was classic shaken baby syndrome. But the defense dismantled that certainty piece by piece. They argued that the medical community was divided, that the triad of symptoms could arise from older injuries or accidents. They portrayed Louise as a scapegoat in a tragedy no one could fully explain. In their version, she was overwhelmed, inexperienced, but never cruel. They called her gentle, earnest, naive. The Porton family sat in silence, their grief filling every pause in the testimony. As the days turned into weeks, the tone of the trial shifted from forensic to philosophical. Experts argued not only about evidence, but about faith in medicine itself. Could science prove intent? Could it even prove guilt beyond reasonable doubt? Every expert who took the stand seemed to unravel the certainty of the last. When the jury returned, the tension was unbearable. Guilty of second-degree murder. The sentence, life in prison. Gasps filled the courtroom, and within hours, Britain erupted in protest. Crowds gathered outside the U.S. Embassy in London. The phrase "Free Louise" echoed on every news network. In America, opinion split. To some, the punishment was just. To others, it was cruel, driven by emotion and politics. Then came the twist. The judge, after reviewing the evidence and public outcry, reduced the conviction to involuntary manslaughter, a rare judicial intervention that stunned both sides. Louise was sentenced to time served, 279 days. By the time she boarded the plane back to England, she was no longer just a nanny. She was a symbol of how justice and tragedy can blur into one. The case didn't end with her release. It changed how the world viewed child injuries, shaking prosecutions, and medical certainty. Doctors began to question old assumptions. Prosecutors became more cautious. Parents, meanwhile, found no closure, only the hollow realization that the truth had slipped between science, sympathy, and the limits of human judgment. Louise's story would live on not because of what she did or didn't do, but because it forced the world to face an uncomfortable question. When tragedy strikes a child, are we seeking truth or simply someone to blame? Louise Porton was 23, living in the small English town of Rugby, when the world came to know her name for reasons that still chill anyone who reads the case. To outsiders, she looked like a struggling young mother, trying to balance life between caring for her two daughters, Lexi, 3, and Scarlett, 17 months, and pursuing a career in modeling. Her social media painted a familiar picture of filtered smiles and confident poses. But behind the phone screen, her home had become a pressure cooker of resentment, exhaustion, and disturbing detachment. Those who knew her later told investigators they sensed a divide between how she wanted to appear and how she lived. She often complained that her children got in the way of her freedom. Friends recalled she would spend hours chatting with men online, leaving the girls unattended. Texts recovered later revealed something far darker. Messages describing the girls as burdens, interruptions to the life she wanted. On the night Lexi first fell ill, emergency services were called. Porton claimed her daughter had stopped breathing, possibly from an infection. Paramedics tried to revive her, but Lexi was gone before sunrise. The death was tragic, but not suspicious, at least not yet. Neighbors brought flowers. Porton took selfies at the hospital. Just 2 weeks later, on a cold February night in 2018, history repeated itself. Little Scarlett was found lifeless in the back seat of her mother's car. What followed was a carefully staged performance of grief. She called emergency services again, her voice trembling, explaining that her baby had suddenly gone quiet. Yet, inconsistencies piled up. Surveillance footage later showed her stopping at a petrol station, calm and composed, minutes after the second death. She scrolled through dating apps that same night. When investigators analyzed her internet searches, they uncovered chilling patterns: how to clear the airways of a child, how to revive a drowned baby, and phrases suggesting deliberate smothering. Detectives quietly reopened Lexi's case. Post-mortem tests, when re-examined, revealed telltale signs of airway obstruction. The coincidences had become a pattern. In a home that should have represented safety, both children had died under identical circumstances within weeks. The motive wasn't money or rage, it was indifference. By the time police arrested her, the illusion had collapsed. Friends refused to defend her. Even her family stood in stunned disbelief. She denied everything, insisting she was a devoted mother caught in misfortune. But the evidence said otherwise. 2 tiny coffins, 2 identical nights, and a mother whose heart seemed colder than the world could comprehend. The courtroom in Birmingham Crown Court was silent as the prosecution unfolded a portrait of a mother without remorse. Louise Porton sat expressionless, her long hair framing a face that rarely betrayed emotion. The Crown alleged what investigators had already suspected, that she had murdered both of her daughters deliberately, driven not by madness but by irritation. The case wasn't about poverty, stress, or an abusive partner. It was about freedom. about a mother who saw her own children as obstacles to the life she wanted. Evidence poured in. Messages to friends, the dating app logs, the internet searches that painted her mind in cold detail. In one exchange, she joked about having no time for men, while her daughter lay in hospital fighting for her life. In another, she texted that her baby was annoying her before attending a photo shoot. When police presented the timeline, the horror became mathematical minutes between messages about dead children and flirtations with strangers. Her defense team tried to humanize her, describing exhaustion, financial strain, and youth. They called it negligence, not malice. But jurors watched the CCTV footage where she moved calmly through a service station as her second child lay lifeless in the car. They heard paramedics testify that her distress felt rehearsed. They saw the pattern: 2 deaths, identical in method, identical in aftermath. The prosecution's argument was chilling in its simplicity. Porton wanted her daughters gone. To her, motherhood was not a calling but a cage. They said she smothered Lexi first, convinced she could get away with it after the initial sympathy. Then, when Scarlett began crying late one night, she decided to end the problem permanently. When the verdict arrived, the room froze. Guilty on both counts of murder. The judge called her actions calculated, cruel, and utterly heartless. He described the deaths as acts of pure evil, sentencing her to life imprisonment with no possibility of release. Even in that moment, Porton didn't flinch. She stared forward, unblinking, as the sentence sealed her fate. The public reaction was visceral. Mothers across the UK voiced disgust and disbelief. Commentators compared her to other notorious child killers, but even among them, Porton stood apart for her apparent indifference. It wasn't rage that killed those children, it was apathy weaponized. In the years since, the Porton case has haunted every conversation about maternal neglect, mental health, and moral decay. She remains behind bars, largely silent, her name synonymous with betrayal in its purest form. 2 small lives ended not in violence's chaos, but in the quiet, deliberate cruelty of the one person meant to protect them. In the quiet suburbs of Charleroi, Belgium, Marc Dutroux appeared to be just another eccentric mechanic, with too many projects and not enough money. His wife, Michelle Martin, once a schoolteacher, lived beside him in a strange, codependent silence. Together, they built a facade of normal life, but beneath their home, behind concrete walls and steel doors, they were constructing something monstrous. It began with trust. Dutroux used his charm, false promises of rides home, and offers of work or shelter to lure young girls into his van. Michelle played the part of reassurance, the motherly presence that erased suspicion. She would smile softly, tell them not to worry, and the girls followed. Once inside, escape was almost impossible. The van led not to safety, but to a secret bunker he had built under his house, soundproofed, hidden behind a heavy steel door, reachable only through a concealed trap. There, in a cramped cell, no larger than a closet, victims were kept for days, even weeks. Some were abused and starved. Others died of neglect when Dutroux was briefly imprisoned for unrelated crimes. Michelle, left in charge, did nothing to help them. She later claimed fear. Investigators called it complicity. The horror was worsened by her calm obedience, the quiet of someone who had accepted evil as routine. When investigators later reconstructed the events, they found the pattern meticulous. Dutroux had installed cameras, recorded everything, and catalogued his acts like trophies. He wasn't improvising. He was orchestrating. He collected locks, chains, blueprints for more underground chambers, as though preparing to industrialize captivity. Neighbors noticed strange noises and missing children posters, but police visits never went deep enough. They took his statements, glanced around, and left. Bureaucracy, incompetence, and disbelief allowed the nightmare to continue. Each disappearance was written off as a runaway, a misunderstanding, or simply bad luck. By the mid-1992s, Belgium was living with a ghost it didn't know yet existed. Parents whispered about vans. Children were kept indoors. The faces of the missing Julie, Melissa, Sabine, and Letitia began to define an entire generation's fear. Behind the facade of a normal household, Marc Dutroux and Michelle Martin were proof of how evil could disguise itself in routine. A mechanic's hands, a teacher's voice, a husband and wife living among their victims' echoes. No one could have imagined that the truth, the cell, the tapes, the shallow graves would not only destroy families, but also the faith of an entire nation in its institutions. The story of Dutroux and Martin was not just a crime. It was a revelation about how easily systems fail when trust replaces vigilance. When Marc Dutroux was finally arrested in 1996, Belgium's faith in its institutions cracked overnight. Police had stumbled upon something far larger than one man's depravity, a system of failure that had allowed evil to grow undisturbed. Two young girls, Sabine and Letitia, were discovered alive in the hidden dungeon beneath his home. Their rescue, captured in haunting police footage, shocked the world. But the revelation that police had searched the same house months earlier and missed them ignited a fury unlike anything Belgium had ever seen. Investigators unearthed evidence linking Dutroux to a string of kidnappings and murders dating back years. Some victims were buried in his garden, others were never found. Michelle Martin, his wife and accomplice, admitted to feeding their captives and to watching as they starved when Dutroux was briefly imprisoned. Her silence had killed as surely as his hands. Together, they became symbols of everything that could go wrong when power, negligence, and cruelty converge. As the trial approached, public outrage boiled into something uncontrollable. Citizens marched in white, hundreds of thousands, wearing pale clothes, to symbolize innocence in what became known as the White March. It wasn't just grief, it was a revolt against apathy. Parents, teachers, and survivors demanded to know how police had ignored warnings, how judges had released a known offender, and how files had gone missing during the investigation. The trial itself was a media storm. Dutroux arrived defiant, smirking, claiming he was part of a larger network. Conspiracy theories flourished, some accusing the government of cover-ups. His wife, Michelle Martin, wept and begged for leniency, portraying herself as another victim. Few believed her. The jury didn't. Dutroux was convicted on multiple counts of kidnapping, rape, and murder, sentenced to life imprisonment. Martin received 30 years, later released after serving half her term, a decision that reignited national anger. But from the ashes of that rage came reform. Belgium overhauled its child protection systems, tightened police coordination, and established missing child networks modeled after the tragedy. The case exposed the dangers of bureaucratic arrogance, how endless paperwork and interagency pride had allowed real lives to slip through the cracks. Even decades later, the name Dutroux still carries a weight no one speaks lightly. The basement where those horrors unfolded was destroyed, but the shadow it cast over Belgium's conscience remains. It's a reminder that evil doesn't always hide in chaos. Sometimes it hides behind locked doors, unchecked, waiting for the system to fail again. In the spring of 1990, the quiet town of Derry, New Hampshire, seemed untouched by scandal. Pamela Smart, a 22-year-old media coordinator at Winnacunnet High School, was bright, ambitious, and married to her high school sweetheart, Greg Smart. From the outside, they were the picture of small-town success, of newlyweds with good jobs and matching smiles. But beneath the surface, their marriage was unraveling. Greg was restless, and Pamela's need for admiration soon led her somewhere darker. She met Billy Flynn, a 15-year-old student, through her volunteer work at Project Self-Esteem, an irony that would later haunt headlines. Flynn, impressionable and infatuated, fell under her spell almost immediately. Pamela played the mentor, the older woman who understood him, but her guidance soon turned into seduction. By winter, their relationship crossed the line between mentorship and manipulation. Flynn saw her as a lover. Pamela saw him as a solution. As her marriage continued to deteriorate, Pamela began speaking openly about how unhappy she was, how she couldn't bear to lose her house or her dog if she divorced. According to testimony, she started planting a seed that Greg needed to disappear. Flynn, too young to grasp the full weight of what she implied, believed her promises of a future together. He and 3 friends, all teenagers, began planning a break-in that would end in blood. On the 1st of May 1990, Greg Smart came home from work as usual. He was ambushed inside his own house by Flynn and Patrick Randall. The scene was chaotic, a mix of teenage panic and deadly intent. Greg was forced to his knees, a gun pressed to his temple. One shot ended his life. The killers fled, staging the scene to look like a robbery. When police arrived, Pamela stood outside, crying, claiming she'd found her husband dead. The act was convincing at first, but as the weeks passed, cracks formed. Her demeanor at the funeral, her eagerness to talk to reporters, her strange calm in the aftermath, it all drew attention. Friends began whispering about her relationship with Flynn. Then came the turning point. A friend, wired by police, recorded Pamela admitting to her role in the plot. "If you tell the police," she warned, "we'll all go to jail." It was a chilling moment. The voice of a young woman who had traded morality for control, affection for power. By the time the tapes reached investigators, the narrative was undeniable. Pamela Smart had not pulled the trigger, but she had orchestrated the murder using her position, her charisma, and a child's love as weapons. The teacher who preached self-esteem had turned mentorship into manipulation, and in doing so, redefined how America saw the line between authority and exploitation. By the time Pamela Smart's trial began in 1991, it had already become a national obsession. Reporters camped outside the courthouse in New Hampshire. Satellite vans lined the streets, and television crews broadcast every expression she made. She was young, attractive, articulate, and accused of orchestrating her husband's murder through teenage lovers. It was the perfect storm for a media spectacle, and America couldn't look away. The prosecution's case was airtight yet surreal. They played the audio recordings, Pamela's own voice, cold and calculating, warning a friend not to go to police. Her tone wasn't panicked or grieving. It was managerial, as if she were discussing a problem at work. Those tapes became the centerpiece of the trial, a kind of moral mirror. Every juror, every viewer at home, could hear the shift from teacher to manipulator. Then came the testimony. Billy Flynn, only 17 at the time of the killing, took the stand. His voice trembled as he described how Pamela had seduced him, convinced him that her husband's death was the only way they could be together. His account was bolstered by his co-conspirators, each detailing how she had guided the plan, step by step when to strike, how to stage it, what to say afterward. The defense argued that Flynn was lying to reduce his own sentence, that Pamela was guilty of poor judgment, not murder. But the evidence, the phone logs, the love letters, the tapes told a story far too precise for coincidence. As the trial went on, it stopped being about one murder and became a reflection of cultural anxieties. Sex, power, youth, and media exploitation. Networks compared her to femme fatales of film noir. Tabloids called her the teacher of death. Court TV broadcast her downfall like a serialized drama, blurring the line between justice and entertainment. When the jury returned, the verdict was swift. Guilty of first-degree murder, conspiracy, and witness tampering. The judge sentenced Pamela Smart to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Billy Flynn and his teenage accomplices received reduced sentences in exchange for their cooperation. Their youthful faces, a haunting reminder of how far manipulation can reach. Even decades later, her name remains a reference point for every case involving authority twisted into control. She has maintained her innocence, claiming she never ordered the killing, that her words were misinterpreted, a relationship misrepresented. Yet, for the public, the evidence had already defined her legacy. Pamela Smart's story was never just about a murder. It was about the corrosion of trust, how a mentor could weaponize affection, and how the power to inspire could so easily become the power to destroy. The pediatric intensive care unit at Bexar County Hospital in San Antonio, Texas, was supposed to be a place of healing rows of tiny incubators, the rhythmic hum of ventilators, the soft footsteps of nurses who called their patients "my babies." Among them was Genene Jones, a young nurse with an almost obsessive energy. Parents loved her enthusiasm. Doctors praised her composure. She had a gift, they said, for being there. When things went wrong, always the first at the bedside. When a monitor alarmed, always calm when others froze. But what they didn't see was that the chaos often started the moment she walked in. Infants who had been stable began crashing suddenly, their tiny bodies convulsing, oxygen levels plummeting without warning. Code after code was called, sometimes multiple in a single shift. Doctors were puzzled, but Jones seemed to thrive under the pressure. She rushed for crash carts, drew up emergency drugs, barked orders like someone in control of fate itself. Other nurses began whispering that something wasn't right. The mortality rate in her ward was climbing, but nobody wanted to accuse the woman who seemed so devoted. The hospital administration brushed it off as coincidence. The ICU was full of fragile lives. Death was part of the job. Still, the pattern was impossible to ignore. Some babies recovered miraculously after Jones's interventions, others didn't. When one physician started tracking the timing of code blues, the correlation was chilling. Jones had been present for nearly all of them. Parents who trusted her would later describe her as kind, attentive, almost motherly. She'd cradle their infants, tell them she'd watch over them personally. They had no reason to suspect the woman wearing the white uniform was orchestrating the very emergencies that terrified them. For Jones, crisis was currency. Each save made her indispensable. Each death added to her aura of tragic heroism. Then came the day when the drugs didn't hide the evidence. A baby named Chelsea McClellan, previously healthy, died during what was supposed to be a routine vaccination at a small-town clinic where Jones had transferred after suspicion grew at the hospital. The autopsy revealed a powerful muscle relaxant one never prescribed to infants. Investigators began digging into her history and the hospital she had worked in. The pattern repeated itself in every file they opened. Sudden collapses, unexplained overdoses, and one nurse always nearby. It was no longer a coincidence. It was a system that had protected her through denial. The woman parents had called their children's guardian angel, had been hiding behind the chaos she created, and now, the evidence was beginning to speak louder than her charm ever could. By the time investigators pieced together the full scale of Genene Jones's actions, years had passed, and dozens of infants had already been buried. The horror wasn't just in what she had done, it was in how long she'd been allowed to keep doing it. When her former supervisor finally ran the numbers, comparing Jones's shifts to infant deaths, the pattern leapt off the page. A spike in fatalities every time she was on duty, then an eerie calm when she wasn't. In 1983, she was finally charged with the murder of one 5-month-old Chelsea McClellan. Prosecutors called her a nurse who created her own emergencies. The courtroom became a battlefield of experts, toxicologists, pediatricians, forensic pathologists, all debating whether the lethal muscle relaxant found in the infant's body had been intentionally administered. The defense argued that Jones was being scapegoated for hospital errors, but the jury didn't buy it. They saw a professional who thrived in crisis, who found purpose in tragedy she engineered herself. Jones was convicted of murder and sentenced to 99 years in prison. But the story didn't end there. Decades later, as her parole eligibility approached, prosecutors launched a desperate campaign to prevent her release. They combed through old hospital records, patient charts, and staff notes searching for the ghosts left behind by her syringe. With advances in medical forensics and digital data analysis, they began to reconstruct what couldn't be proven in the 1,980 seconds. That Chelsea's death had been only one of many. New indictments followed. Jones faced 5 additional murder charges, cases long cold, victims long buried, but evidence newly illuminated by technology. Each file revealed the same chilling rhythm: sudden collapses, unexplained injections, and Genene Jones always nearby, her name inked neatly in the duty logs. She pleaded guilty to one of the new charges in 2020, admitting at last what had been whispered for decades. For Texas lawmakers, the case became a turning point. Hospitals rewrote protocols for reporting suspicious deaths. Pediatric units began tracking mortality trends by shift. State legislation mandated that medical institutions could no longer quietly dismiss problem employees without alerting regulators. The phrase crash cart culture, born from Jones's constant interventions, became a warning in nursing ethics courses across America. Genene Jones now spends her final years behind bars, stripped of her license and legacy. The hospitals where she once worked have been remodeled, their walls repainted, but her name still circulates in whispered caution among nurses and parents alike. She wasn't the monster in the shadows, she was the caregiver, standing beside the bed, smiling softly as the machines began to scream.
The principal who vanished across borders.
In Melbourne's ultra-Orthodox community during the early 2000s, Melka Leifer was seen as a model of faith and discipline. As principal of the Adass Israel School, she commanded respect, a woman entrusted with shaping young girls into devout, educated women. Her authority was absolute, her image spotless. But behind the locked office doors and whispered meetings, a far darker story was unfolding. One of grooming, manipulation, and betrayal, hidden beneath layers of religious respectability. The girls she targeted were teenagers, students, who saw her as a spiritual mother. She praised them for their piety, gave them extra attention, and gradually blurred every boundary a teacher was supposed to keep. Survivors would later describe how Leifer used religious authority as both shield and weapon, making her victims believe their special relationship was something holy, something they couldn't question. Each act of abuse was wrapped in guilt and silence. She told them it was their duty to obey, that questioning her would shame their families. For years, parents and teachers noticed nothing. Leifer's reputation as a strict but caring principal deflected suspicion. She organized school events, spoke at community gatherings, and lectured about modesty and virtue, while systematically destroying the innocence of the very children she was charged to protect. When whispers began circulating, the school board acted swiftly not to protect the victims, but to protect the institution. In 2008, as police began receiving complaints, Leifer was quietly flown out of Australia under the pretense of a sabbatical. Within days, she had vanished to Israel. There was no formal dismissal, no warning to parents, only silence. What followed was a decade-long nightmare for her victims, who came forward publicly, demanding her return to face justice. While Australian authorities filed for her extradition, Leifer claimed mental illness to avoid trial. For years, she lived freely in an Israeli settlement, even teaching religious classes again. Court hearings stalled repeatedly, as psychiatrists debated her fitness to stand trial. Each delay deepened the wounds of the survivors, who watched the woman who'd shaped their childhoods continue to manipulate systems just as she once manipulated them. In time, and bureaucracy could conspire to protect the predator rather than the children. Leifer wasn't just a criminal on the run. She was a symbol of how institutions cloak abuse in reverence, using belief as armor. Her students once called her Principal Leifer. Now, the world called her what she truly was: a fugitive from accountability. By the time Melka Leifer finally stepped off a plane in Melbourne in 2021, more than 12 years had passed since she fled. Cameras flashed as she was escorted in handcuffs through the airport, an image that marked the end of one of the longest and most controversial extradition battles in Australian history. For her survivors, it wasn't just a return, it was a reckoning. The years between her escape and her arrival back in Australia were defined by frustration and defiance. Her former students, Dassie Ehrlich, Ellie Sapper, and Nicole Meyer, had become activists, turning their trauma into a public crusade for accountability. They met with lawmakers, held press conferences, and rallied international support to pressure Israel into extraditing her. Every delay in the courtroom, every time Leifer claimed she was too mentally unfit to face trial, was met with outrage and disbelief. Investigations later revealed she had been living comfortably, teaching again, and moving freely. The manipulation had crossed borders, and once again, the system had failed the very people it was meant to protect. Finally, in 2019, Israeli authorities determined that Leifer had been faking her mental illness. After years of stalling, a judge ruled her fit for extradition. In 2021, she was placed on a flight back to Australia, her disguise as a frail, broken woman stripped away. For the survivors waiting in Melbourne, it was a moment both triumphant and hollow. Justice was coming, but too late to undo the damage. Her trial began in 2023. The testimonies were raw, each account a piece of the same nightmare, a trusted principal, using her power to isolate, manipulate, and violate her students. She had turned the language of faith into a tool of coercion. When the guilty verdict came, it carried not just legal weight, but emotional closure. Leifer was sentenced to 15 years in prison, a symbolic but long-awaited acknowledgement of what had been denied for so long. The case reshaped how Australia handles child protection within religious institutions. It exposed the dangers of unregulated authority and the cultural barriers that allow abuse to fester in closed communities. It also showed the power of persistence, 3 sisters who refused to stay silent until the system finally listened. In the end, Leifer's story wasn't just one of crime, but of endurance. Her victims had grown from silent schoolgirls into global advocates for reform. Their pain had rewritten laws, reshaped extradition policies, and reminded the world that when institutions fail, survivors can become their own justice. Melka Leifer's name will forever be tied to betrayal not just of children, but of faith, trust, and the very idea that those in power are there to protect. In the quiet suburb of Dover,
Part 13,
Delaware,
the Step
Tanya
Guardian's
Kasabian
Mask.
was known as a doting stepmother and trusted caregiver. To neighbors, she was the kind of woman who smiled easily, who called the children her angels, who baked cookies for fundraisers and posted family pictures online with cheerful captions. What no one saw behind those carefully staged smiles was a pattern of cruelty that stretched back years, hidden beneath the language of care, discipline, and maternal love. The children in her home were too young to understand what was happening. Tanya controlled every detail of their lives: what they ate, who they spoke to, how they behaved. When bruises appeared, she blamed rough play. When teachers noticed fear in the children's eyes, she dismissed it as discipline problems. It was a familiar pattern for investigators, the abuser who hides in plain sight, who knows exactly how to manipulate the system's blind spots. Her home, supposedly a place of healing, became a small fortress of fear. She used isolation as punishment, withholding food or affection to enforce obedience. The children learned quickly that any resistance meant pain, and any plea for help would be twisted into a lie. What made it even more chilling was how Tanya weaponized her role as caregiver. She was not the stranger in the shadows, but the person every child was told to trust. The first real crack in her facade came when one of the children spoke up at school, trembling as they described what Mom did when the doors were closed. The teacher alerted authorities, but even then, Tanya's charm and rehearsed tears almost derailed the investigation. She claimed the children were troubled, that they were acting out, that she was the victim of a misunderstanding. It was the same performance she'd given to friends and neighbors for years, and for a time, it worked. But social workers began connecting the dots. Medical records showing repeated accidents, emotional evaluations that pointed to trauma, and a trail of inconsistencies in her statements. When police finally searched the home, they found journals the children had written in secret, desperate fragments of truth, scribbled in fear. They wrote about punishments that lasted hours, meals withheld for days, and words so cruel they burned deeper than bruises. In court, Tanya maintained her innocence, insisting she was a loving stepmother, unfairly vilified. But the evidence, much of it from the children themselves, was overwhelming. The jury saw what the neighborhood never did: a woman who turned trust into control, affection into a weapon. She was convicted of multiple counts of child abuse and neglect, her sentence closing a chapter that had taken years to expose. The case reignited a national debate about step-parental oversight and background checks for caregivers. It revealed how the system often protects the image of family over the safety of those trapped within it. Tanya Kasabian's story is now a haunting lesson that the worst betrayals often come from those who say they love you most, and that sometimes evil hides behind a smile that everyone else believes. In the small Queensland town of Rockhampton, few questioned the authority of Brother Bede Mackerel. As a Catholic brother and principal of several Christian brothers' schools, his word carried the weight of both education and religion. Parents trusted him with their sons' futures. Students were taught that obedience to men like him was obedience to God. But under that cloak of sanctity lay something unholy: years of quiet abuse, covered by walls of faith and silence. For the boys who attended those schools, Mackerel's presence inspired fear, not respect. He ruled with strict discipline, enforcing rules through humiliation and physical punishment. Behind closed doors, that control turned into something far worse. Survivors later testified that he used his position to isolate vulnerable students, targeting those who were timid, homesick, or without family nearby. He framed his abuse as correction, a twisted extension of spiritual guidance. To the church, he was a brother. To those boys, he was the nightmare they could never speak of. The first complaint surfaced decades later, long after Mackerel had retired. By then, his victims were middle-aged men, carrying invisible scars. One by one, they began to tell their stories of fear, of shame, and of how they had been silenced by the authority of the institution that claimed to protect them. The testimonies painted a devastating picture: a system that had known, or at least suspected, but chose to move him quietly from one school to another, rather than confront the truth. Each transfer gave him new victims and erased the old ones. When Mackerel was finally brought to trial in 2018, the court heard from multiple survivors describing nearly identical patterns of assault. They spoke of dormitories, where the lights never fully went out, of whispered prayers for morning to come, and of how the line between discipline and domination blurred under his authority. The defense argued that his age and ill health made him unfit for imprisonment, but the judge was unmoved. The sentence was short, but the acknowledgement was enormous. The church's veil of silence had finally been pierced. Outside the courtroom, survivors wept not out of vengeance, but validation. For decades, they'd been told to forget, to forgive, to move on. Now, at last, the world had listened. Mackerel's conviction became part of a larger wave of justice within Australia's reckoning with institutional abuse. It reminded the public that evil doesn't always wear a monster's face sometimes. It stands at the front of a classroom, dressed in robes of faith, holding a Bible instead of a weapon. The church issued apologies. Politicians promised reform. But for those who endured it, no words could undo the years stolen in silence. Brother Bede Mackerel died shortly after his conviction, never fully serving his sentence. Yet his name, once spoken with reverence, now lives as a warning that blind faith without accountability breeds the very darkness it seeks to condemn. From the outside, the Turpin family looked picture-perfect: 13 children,
became jailers,
matching clothes, family photos arranged in neat rows, and a modest home in Paris, California. To neighbors, David and Louise Turpin seemed quiet, overly private, maybe a little strange but harmless. What no one knew was that behind those drawn curtains lay one of the darkest domestic secrets in modern America. A home turned prison, parents turned captors, and the word care twisted into something unspeakable. For years, the Turpins presented themselves as devout, disciplined, and deeply protective. They homeschooled their children, telling outsiders they valued faith and family over society's corruption. But inside, the reality was closer to a nightmare. The children, ranging in age from 2 to 29, were chained to beds, starved for food, and forbidden to speak to one another. They lived in filth while their parents dined on takeout in the next room. Their supposed caregivers treated neglect as discipline and torture as education. Louise Turpin, with her floral dresses and soft voice, was the enforcer of obedience. David, the patriarch, hid behind the facade of faith. They called it raising them right. They isolated their children so completely that even neighbors didn't know how many lived inside the house. When one of the daughters, 17 years old but looking barely 10 from malnourishment, finally escaped through a window in 2018 and called 911, the world heard the story directly from her trembling voice. "My parents are abusing us," she said. "They're chained up." The responding officers thought it was exaggeration until they entered the home. The stench hit first: rot, waste, and decay. Then, they saw the reality: children thin as skeletons, shackles bolted to furniture, a refrigerator filled with food they weren't allowed to touch. What investigators uncovered defied comprehension. Years of starvation, beatings, and psychological torment disguised as parenting. When the trial began, prosecutors described the Turpin home as a house of horrors. The parents pleaded guilty to multiple counts of torture, false imprisonment, and child endangerment. They were sentenced to life in prison. But the aftermath revealed another tragedy. Even after rescue, the system that promised to protect the children often failed them. Some ended up in exploitative foster homes. Others struggled with trauma that no institution was prepared to heal. The Turpin case forced America to confront a terrifying truth. Abuse doesn't always hide in alleyways or strangers' hands. Sometimes, it thrives under the roof of a family that looks just like everyone else. The story shattered the illusion that parenthood automatically means protection. It exposed the cracks in oversight, the gaps in child welfare, and the danger of blind faith in appearances. Today, the surviving Turpin children are rebuilding their lives in private. Their courage, especially that single desperate escape call, stands as proof that even after years of silence, truth can still find a voice. But the house on Muir Woods Road remains a reminder that the people trusted to nurture can also destroy, and that sometimes love must begin with rescue. Across every story, from stepmothers and nannies to nurses and priests, one truth cuts through. The people trusted to protect became the ones to fear. They were not monsters hiding in alleys or strangers breaking in at night. They were familiar faces, caregivers, guardians, mentors, all cloaked in the comfort of normalcy. Their power didn't come from violence alone, but from trust. And once that trust was broken, it didn't just destroy families. It fractured the very idea of safety itself. The pattern is always the same. Institutions that should have intervened chose silence. Families who suspected the truth turned away, too afraid or too ashamed to believe it. Churches transferred offenders instead of exposing them. Schools dismissed whispers as rumors. Hospitals ignored the numbers because the alternative was too horrific to confront. Evil didn't slip through the cracks. It was protected by them. In these homes, classrooms, and sanctuaries, authority became a weapon. A caregiver's touch, meant to heal, became a tool of control. A teacher's praise became manipulation. A parent's guidance turned into domination. Every role built on compassion was hollowed out and replaced with power. And because the world could not imagine such darkness within something so ordinary, it kept happening again and again. But each revelation, each survivor who spoke, forced the world to look closer. It made oversight more than a checkbox. It became a moral necessity. Hospitals installed review boards. Schools began tracking misconduct more transparently. Religious orders faced tribunals. Every reform written in law carries the fingerprints of those who suffered before it, the children who survived what should have been love. And yet, the lesson remains fragile. Systems can still be fooled. Titles still inspire blind trust. The facade of kindness still disarms those looking for danger. Real protection, as these stories show, requires vigilance not just from institutions, but from everyone who dares to believe that care alone is safety. The irony of it all is haunting. Humanity built these structures, families, schools, faiths, to nurture and defend the vulnerable. But when power replaces empathy, those very sanctuaries become prisons. The children, the patients, the students, they weren't betrayed by strangers. They were betrayed by the people who vowed to shelter them. And so the closing truth stands stark. Evil doesn't always scream. Sometimes it whispers bedtime prayers. Sometimes it smiles from behind a teacher's desk. And sometimes it tucks you in at night, promising love right before turning out the light.